How does a brand new country, born with its hands tied, somehow grow into a continental power? Well, that's the incredible story of Brazil's first century. It's this really brutal and fascinating journey from a nation that was totally constrained by European powers to a major player that was actually shaping the destiny of South America. So let's get into it.
All right, we're going to break this story down into 5 key parts. First, we'll look at how Brazil's independence came at a seriously high price. Then, we'll dive into the high-stakes chess match for control of the Rio de la Plata basin. After that, we'll see how the Brazilian Empire finally went on the offensive. Then comes the big one, the devastating Paraguayan War that literally changed the continent. And finally, we'll see the dawn of Brazil's golden age of diplomacy.
Okay, so let's start at the very beginning. Brazil's birth as a nation, well, it was anything but a clean break. It was more like a complicated negotiation, where sovereignty came with some major strings attached. And those strings were mostly being pulled by the world's superpower at the time, Great Britain.
So picture this, September 7th, 1822, Brazil declares its independence. And honestly, it's a moment of immense promise. I mean, you look around and its Spanish-American neighbors are shattering into a bunch of different republics. But Brazil, it manages to hold its massive territory together under a single government led by the Portuguese Crown Prince, Dom Pedro I. It even has a working government right from day one. But right beneath that surface of strength, there was a fundamental, critical weakness.
And this one number pretty much says it all, 15%. See, to get Great Britain to even recognize its independence, Brazil had to agree to a special customs tariff. This meant any British goods coming into Brazil could only be taxed at a maximum of 15%. Now that doesn't just sound like a number, it was an economic straitjacket. It meant the new country couldn't use tariffs to protect its own brand new industries, and worse, it couldn't generate the cash it desperately needed to, build a country, roads, schools, and army. Basically, Brazil's economic freedom was handcuffed from the moment it was born.
And this slide really breaks down the full price tag. To get Portugal on board, Brazil had to pay them £2 million sterling. And get this, a huge chunk of that was to cover the debts Portugal ran up while fighting against Brazilian independence. It's crazy. Then you have that 15% tariff cap, which starved the treasury for decades. And on top of all that, Britain was pushing hard for Brazil to abolish the slave trade, which caused huge internal fights with the powerful landowners whose entire economy depended on it. So this was a nation born in debt and totally divided.
As you can imagine, this shackled start threw Brazil into a period of just constant crisis. There was the super costly Cisplatinine War over a strategic buffer zone in the south, which ended with Britain basically forcing everyone to create an independent Uruguay. Internally, things were a mess. Political chaos led to the emperor just abdicating the throne, and then the massive Farroupilha War in the south dragged on for a decade and threatened to literally rip the country in two. In these early years, Brazil's foreign policy wasn't about grand strategy. It was a desperate fight for survival.
So with Brazil just trying to hold itself together, the stage was set for the great game of the 19th century in South America, the struggle for control over the Rio de la Plata basin. This was the strategic heart of the continent, and Brazil was about to play for the highest stakes imaginable.
On one side of the board, you have the Brazilian Empire. Its main goal was to keep Uruguay and Paraguay as independent buffer states. This was all about securing its southern border and, crucially, its access to the interior of the continent. On the other side, you have the powerful Argentine dictator Juan Manuel de Rosas. He wanted to absorb both of those nations and rebuild the old Spanish viceroyalty. I mean, these were two completely opposite visions for the future of the region.
And this is exactly why it mattered so much. The river system was basically the highway to the heart of South America. If you controlled the rivers, you controlled trade, and you could project military power deep into the continent. For Brazil, free navigation of those rivers was the only practical way to reach its massive landlocked province of Mato Grosso. So the small nations of Uruguay and Paraguay became these key chess pieces, with both Brazil and Argentina funding and arming opposite political parties inside them, all to try and gain control.
Now, for years, Brazil was stuck playing defense. But by the mid-1840s, things started to change. With the internal revolts finally put down and the country stabilizing under Emperor Dom Pedro II, the empire decided it was time to stop reacting and start acting. It was time to take on Rosas directly.
And Brazil's approach here was just masterful. It was so methodical, not impulsive at all. First, they ended that long Farroupilha revolt, which freed up their entire military. Second, they built a powerful coalition by allying with Rosas's main rival inside Argentina, a guy named Justo José de Requesa. Third, they used their financial power in what was called the diplomacy of money, basically secretly bankrolling Rosas's opponents to weaken him from the inside. Only then, with all the pieces perfectly in place, did they make their final decisive move.
And that final move was the Battle of Montecaseros in 1852. A huge Allied army, bankrolled by Brazil and backed by its navy, completely crushed Rosas' forces right outside Buenos Aires. After 20 years of iron-fisted rule, the dictator was overthrown. He fled into exile, and just like that, Brazil's biggest geopolitical rival was gone. It was an absolutely stunning victory that cemented Brazil's power in the region, guaranteed the independence of Uruguay and Paraguay, and opened up those vital river networks. But as you know, history is never that simple. This big victory created a power vacuum, and a new, really ambitious player emerged to fill it: Paraguay. And this would spark the single deadliest interstate war in the history of South America, a conflict that would change the continent forever.
So what kicked it all off? Well, you guessed it. Uruguay, again. When Brazil decided to intervene in yet another Uruguayan civil war, the leader of Paraguay, Francisco Solano Lopez, saw it as a direct threat to his country's survival. He was terrified of being surrounded by too much bigger powers, so he warned Brazil to back off. Brazil just ignored it.
Lopez responded by seizing a Brazilian ship and invading Mato Grosso. Pretty soon, Argentina and Uruguay joined Brazil, forming the Triple Alliance. What they all thought would be a quick, easy victory turned into a brutal 5-year war of attrition. The Paraguayan army fought with this unbelievable ferocity on its home turf, and they put up a defense that shocked the continent, especially at the nearly unbreakable fortress of Humaitá, which held up the entire Allied advance for over 2 years. The war became this grinding, bloody siege that only ended when Lopez himself was killed in combat, leaving his country in absolute ruins.
So the war was over. The Triple Alliance had won. But this victory came at an almost unimaginable cost, and it raised some really profound questions for all the nations involved. It also set the stage for a whole new set of conflicts.
For Paraguay, the war was a complete apocalypse. It lost a massive portion of its male population, and its economy was just destroyed. But the winners also paid a huge price. Brazil was now buried under massive debt, and the war had professionalized its military, creating this powerful new political force that would eventually overthrow the very empire it had just fought for. And that alliance with Argentina? It shattered almost the second the war ended, replaced by a tense, decades-long rivalry over the spoils.
After all that bloodshed, something had to give. The fall of the Brazilian Empire in 1889 brought in a new republic, and with it, a radical shift in foreign policy. After a century of settling things with armies, Brazil was ready to trade the sword for the pen.
I mean, think about it. For most of the 19th century, this was how Brazil solved its biggest geopolitical problems, with force of arms. It was just the established way of doing things.
But the new republic decided to try something completely different, a new strategy that was almost revolutionary at the time, resolving its incredibly complex border disputes, not on a battlefield, but in a courtroom, through legal arguments and international arbitration.
And this entire shift can pretty much be summed up in one man, the Baron of Rio Branco. This guy wasn't a general, he was a historian and a diplomat. And as foreign minister, he went on a mission to settle Brazil's borders, all of them, once and for all. His weapons weren't cannons and rifles, they were ancient maps, old colonial treaties, and just these brilliantly constructed legal arguments.
And his success rate, it was just staggering. He won a huge piece of territory from Argentina through arbitration by the U.S. president. He secured Brazil's northern border against French claims with Swiss arbitration. He even peacefully negotiated the purchase of the Acre territory from Bolivia. Rio Branco's diplomacy basically drew the modern map of Brazil, and he did it all without firing a single shot. He created this legacy of legalism and negotiation that, really, defines Brazilian foreign policy to this day.
Let's end with this quote from the great writer Machado de Assis. It's a hope for a new era of friendship between Brazil and its great rival, Argentina. And after a century of so much conflict, it was a vision that Rio Branco's diplomacy actually helped make possible. It really makes you wonder, right? How much of a nation's destiny is shaped not by the strength of its armies, but by the power of its arguments.